The October wind carried the smell of diesel and salt water across the main gate of Naval Air Station Coronado. A white government sedan rolled to a stop just outside the checkpoint, engine idling as the driver shifted into park. The woman in the back seat gathered her single duffel bag, thanked the corporal behind the wheel, and stepped out onto the pavement. She wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray zip-up hoodie with a faded university logo, and running shoes that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No jewelry, no watch, nothing that would make anyone look twice. Commander Victoria Hayes, the guard at the gate, barely glanced up from his clipboard. He took her temporary ID badge, scanned it with the same board efficiency he'd used on the last 50 people, and waved her through without a word. Another transfer, he muttered to the Marine standing beside him. Probably admin. They've been cycling people through logistics all month. The Marine nodded, sipping his coffee. Hope she lasts longer than the last one. That girl quit after 2 weeks. Neither of them noticed the way the woman walked. Shoulders back, head up, eyes moving constantly, taking in the layout of the base, the condition of the buildings, the positions of security cameras. She moved like someone who had spent years walking the decks of warships, someone who could read a command structure just by watching personnel move through a space. No one knew the truth. The new girl wasn't a clerk. She was Rear Admiral Elena Cross, and she was about to become Coronado's new commanding officer. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories, so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Elena Cross had worn the uniform for 23 years. She had commanded destroyers in the Persian Gulf, coordinated strike groups in the South China Sea, and sat in Pentagon war rooms making decisions that affected thousands of lives. She had been promoted to Rear Admiral at 39, one of the youngest in modern Navy history. But that morning, she looked like any other tired civilian contractor arriving for another mundane government job. The duffel bag over her shoulder held 3 changes of clothes, a laptop, and a single framed photograph of her late father, a Navy captain who had taught her that leadership wasn't about the stars on your collar. It was about knowing your people, really knowing them. Not the version they showed visiting brass during inspections, but the real human beings who kept a base running when no one important was watching. That's why she was here, undercover, dressed like someone nobody would remember. Coronado had problems. Deep ones. The kind that didn't show up in official reports but festered beneath the surface until they became critical failures. Equipment readiness was declining. Morale was bottoming out. Personnel retention was abysmal. 3 separate anonymous complaints had made it all the way to the Secretary of the Navy's office, painting a picture of a base that had lost its way. The traditional approach would have been to arrive with full ceremony change of command, dress whites, speeches about honor and excellence. But Elena had learned something over 2 decades of service. People behaved differently when they thought an admiral was watching. They hid problems. They painted over rust. They smiled and said everything was fine until the brass left, and then they went back to surviving a broken system. So she had requested something different. 5 days. No rank. No authority. Just a temporary ID badge and permission to observe the base as an anonymous transfer waiting for permanent assignment. 5 days to see Coronado as it really was. Then she would reveal herself. And then she would fix what was broken. The administrative building rose ahead of her, a 3-story concrete structure that looked like it had been built in the 1970s, and hadn't been updated since. The paint was fading. One of the windows on the 2nd floor was cracked and taped over with cardboard. The landscaping consisted of struggling shrubs that no one had bothered to water. First impression: neglect. She pulled open the glass door and stepped inside. The lobby smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, half of them flickering. A television mounted in the corner played a muted news channel that no one was watching. Behind the reception desk sat a young petty officer, maybe 22 years old, with the hollow-eyed look of someone working a shift they hated. His name tag read, Chen. He didn't look up when Elena approached. "Help you?" he asked. eyes still on his computer screen. Elena slid her paperwork across the desk. Administrative transfer. Reporting as ordered. Chen glanced at the documents for maybe 3 seconds, didn't even read her name, and stamped them with practiced indifference. He handed her a temporary badge and a base map that looked like it had been photocopied so many times the text was barely readable. Personnel office is 2nd floor. Room 203. They'll get you sorted. Thank you, Elena said quietly. He had already returned to whatever he was doing on his computer. Probably not work, based on the angle he was sitting. Elena walked toward the elevator, memorizing details. The fire extinguisher in the corner was 3 months past its inspection date. The emergency exit sign had a burned-out bulb. The bulletin board was covered in outdated notices of fun run from 6 months ago, a safety brief that had expired, a flyer for a mental health seminar that no one had bothered to take down after it was canceled. Small things. But small things added up. They told a story about a place where standards had slipped so gradually that no one noticed anymore. The elevator groaned as it carried her upward. The 2nd floor hallway was empty and quiet. Too quiet for a Monday morning on an active Naval Air Station. She could hear a phone ringing somewhere in the distance. Unanswered. Room 203 had a frosted glass door with a handwritten sign taped to it. Personnel knock before entering. Elena knocked. Come in. A voice called. Flat and tired. The office inside was cramped and cluttered. Filing cabinets lined the walls, stuffed so full that some of the drawers wouldn't close. Stacks of folders covered every available surface. The single window looked out onto a parking lot full of vehicles that probably shouldn't still be in service. Behind the desk sat Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb. Mid-40s. Thinning hair. Uniform pressed, but wrinkled in a way that suggested he'd been wearing it since yesterday. He looked up at Elena with the expression of a man who had processed too many transfers and cared about none of them. Transfer orders? He asked. Elena handed them over. Webb scanned them quickly to actually read them. The documents were intentionally vague, listing her simply as administrative support, temporary assignment pending placement. Her actual rank and position had been classified above Webb's clearance level. All he saw was another warm body to plug into an understaffed department. Cross, he said, reading her name off the top line. Welcome to Coronado. We're assigning you to the logistics office. They're drowning over there. Major Castillo is your supervisor. She'll brief you on duties. Yes, sir, Elena replied. What can you tell me about the logistics operation here? Webb laughed a short, bitter sound. What can I tell you? It's a disaster. We're 6 months behind on critical requisitions. The supply chain is held together with duct tape and prayer. Half the time we don't know where our equipment is. The other half, we know exactly where it is and can't get authorization to fix it. He tossed her orders into a tray already overflowing with papers. But, hey, you're here now. Maybe you'll fix it. His tone made it clear he didn't believe that for a second. Logistics is in Building 7. He continued. Across the quad. Past the mess hall. Can't miss it. Tell Castillo I sent you. She'll get you set up. Thank you, sir. Webb had already turned back to his computer before Elena finished speaking. She left the office, walked back down the hallway, and stepped outside into the California sun. The base stretched out before her hangars in the distance. Aircraft parked on the flight line, personnel moving between buildings with the purposeful stride of people who had somewhere to be but no enthusiasm about getting there. She started walking toward Building 7, watching everything. A group of young sailors sat on a bench outside the mess hall, smoking and checking their phones. They should have been at their duty stations. No one seemed to care. A maintenance truck sat in the middle of a parking lot with its hood open, tools scattered on the ground around it. It looked like someone had started a repair and then just abandoned it. Near the flight line, she could see aircraft F/A-18 seconds, mostly, but several of them had red tags hanging from their canopies. Grounded, waiting for parts that probably weren't coming anytime soon. This wasn't just neglect. This was a base that had stopped believing things could get better. Building 7 was louder than the administrative building. She could hear it before she even opened the door, phones ringing, printers jamming, raised voices discussing problems that had no easy solutions. Inside, the logistics office was chaos barely contained, desks crammed together, filing cabinets overflowing, whiteboards covered in scribbled notes that no one had erased in weeks, computer monitors glowing with spreadsheets that scrolled endlessly downward, and in the center of it all stood Major Rachel Castillo. Late 30s, dark hair pulled back in a bun that had started to come loose. Uniform, rumpled. Eyes bloodshot from too many late nights staring at requisition forms. She held a phone to one ear while simultaneously typing on a laptop and gesturing at a junior officer who looked like he was about to cry. "I don't care what the system says." Castillo snapped into the phone. "We submitted that request 8 weeks ago. Either you find it, or I'm escalating this to the Regional Supply Command. Your choice." She slammed the phone down, not hung up, slammed, and turned to the junior officer. "Lieutenant Kim, I need you to track down every single open requisition from July. Cross-reference them with what actually arrived. I want to know where the gaps are." "Ma'am, the system doesn't." "Then do it manually." Castillo's voice cracked slightly. She took a breath. Softer this time. "Please, Kim. I know it's a mess, but we need accurate data or we'll never dig out of this hole." Kim nodded and retreated to his desk, looking defeated before he even started. Castillo finally noticed Elena standing near the door. "Can I help you?" "Major Castillo. I'm Cross. Lieutenant Commander Webb sent me. Administrative transfer." For a moment, Castillo just stared at her. Then she laughed, not with humor, but with the exhausted resignation of someone who had been given one more task when she was already drowning. "Of course he did," Castillo muttered. "Welcome to hell, Cross. Hope you're good with spreadsheets and don't mind working late. Because we're understaffed, behind schedule, and critically low on both patience and coffee." She gestured toward an empty desk shoved into a corner. "That's yours. Log in with the temp credentials on the sticky note. Start by processing the intake queue. Anything flagged red needs immediate attention. Anything flagged yellow is probably already too late, but try anyway." "Questions?" Elena shook her head. "No, ma'am." "Good. Get to work." Elena moved to the desk and sat down. The chair was broken, it tilted to the left, and wouldn't adjust. The keyboard was missing 2 keys. The mouse barely worked, but the monitor came to life when she jiggled the cable, and that was enough. The intake queue had 247 items waiting. She got to work. For the next 3 hours, Elena processed requisitions, tracked shipments, and navigated a supply chain system that seemed designed to frustrate anyone who used it. She didn't complain, didn't ask for help. Just worked steadily, methodically, watching and listening to everything happening around her. She heard Castillo on the phone, begging a supplier to expedite a shipment of engine parts that had been delayed for 2 months. She heard Lieutenant Kim arguing with someone from the finance office about budget codes that didn't match the paperwork. She heard a civilian contractor explaining to a furious maintenance chief that the replacement radios they'd ordered had been rerouted to another base by mistake and wouldn't be available for another 6 weeks. Every conversation painted the same picture. A system that had broken down so completely that good people were burning themselves out trying to keep it functional. And no one seemed to think there was any way to fix it. By lunchtime, Elena's eyes burned from staring at the screen, but she'd cleared 60 items from the queue. Not because she was faster than anyone else, though she was, but because she knew the system. She had helped design parts of it, back when she'd been a junior officer working supply chain logistics in San Diego. She knew which fields could be left blank without causing delays. She knew which approval chains could be bypassed for certain items. She knew the unofficial workarounds that made the official system actually function. But she didn't show off. She just worked. When Castillo announced a lunch break, Elena stood and stretched. Her back ached, her wrists were sore. She felt like she'd been doing this job for years instead of hours. The mess hall was a 10-minute walk across the base. Elena joined the flow of personnel heading that direction, listening to conversations as she walked. Two enlisted sailors behind her were complaining about a training exercise that had been cancelled for the third time due to equipment failures. A group of officers ahead of her were discussing transfer requests. Everyone wanted off Coronado, apparently. No one wanted to stay. Inside the mess hall, the food was adequate. Not terrible, but not good. Institutional. Functional. The kind of meal designed to fill stomachs without inspiring anyone. Elena took her tray to a table near the back corner, close enough to hear conversations, far enough to avoid drawing attention. She ate slowly, watching. At the table to her left, 3 junior officers were venting frustration about a new training protocol that had been implemented without proper guidance. "Whoever wrote this thing has never actually run a drill," one of them said, shaking his head. "Half the steps don't make sense." The other, to half contradict each other. "Typical Pentagon genius," another replied. "Some admiral sits in an office in D.C. and decides how we should do our jobs without ever asking the people actually doing the work." Elena kept her expression neutral, but internally, she winced. She had been part of the team that drafted that protocol. It had made sense on paper. But clearly, something had been lost in translation. Note to self: fix that. At another table, she overheard a conversation between 2 maintenance chiefs. "Third hydraulic failure this month," one of them said. "We keep ordering replacements, but they never show up. And when they do show up, they're the wrong parts." "Supply chain's a joke," the other agreed. "We're cannibalizing parts from one bird to keep another flying. It's unsustainable." Elena made mental notes. Hydraulic systems. Supply chain failures. Equipment cannibalization. She finished her meal and stood to leave. As she walked toward the exit, she passed a table where several senior officers sat, commanders and lieutenant commanders, judging by their rank insignia. One of them, a commander with graying hair and a permanent scowl, was holding court. "You hear about the new CO coming in?" he asked the others. "Some hotshot admiral," another replied. "Supposedly a tactical genius. Youngest rear admiral in recent history." Or something like that. The first commander snorted. "Yeah, well, tactical genius doesn't mean she knows how to run a base. These fast-track types always think they have all the answers. They show up, make a bunch of changes that sound good in briefings, then disappear before the consequences hit. Give her 6 months." Another officer chimed in. "She'll either transfer out or realize this place is unfixable and stop trying." They all laughed bitter, cynical laughter. Elena walked past without reacting. Her face stayed calm, but inside, something cold and sharp settled into place. They thought she was going to fail. They thought Coronado was unfixable. They had given up before she'd even arrived. Well, she'd see about that. The afternoon brought more of the same. Requisitions, tracking numbers, shipment delays, bureaucratic dead ends. But Elena was also watching the people around her. Major Castillo worked without stopping, no breaks, no water. Just constant motion. She was competent, dedicated, and clearly running on fumes. She had the look of someone who cared deeply about doing her job well, but had been let down by the system so many times that she no longer expected success. Lieutenant Kim was younger, less experienced, but equally committed. He made mistakes, but he learned from them quickly. He had potential if someone took the time to mentor him properly. Sergeant First Class Maria Ortega, one of the enlisted logistics specialists, moved through the office like a conductor leading an orchestra. She knew where every form was, who to call for every problem, and how to navigate the bureaucracy with ruthless efficiency. She was the kind of NCO who held an entire operation together through sheer force of will. These were good people. Skilled people. They weren't the problem. The system was the problem. And systems could be fixed. If you had the authority. Near the end of the day, Castillo approached Elena's desk. "You cleared 112 items today." Elena looked up. "Yes, ma'am. That's more than anyone else has done in a week." Castillo's eyes narrowed slightly. "Where'd you work before this?" Elena kept her answer vague. "Various postings. Supply chain, mostly. You're overqualified for data entry." I'm happy to help wherever I'm needed, ma'am. Castillo studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. All right. Keep doing what you're doing. God knows we need the help. She walked away, but Elena could feel the question lingering in the air. Who are you really? It was only a matter of time before people started asking that question out loud. Elena left Building 7 as the sun was setting, painting the California sky in shades of orange and pink. Most of the base was winding down for the evening. She could hear aircraft engines in the distance, training flights returning. Probably, she decided to take a walk around the base, familiarize herself with the layout, see what things looked like when the workday ended and people relaxed. The flight line was quiet now. The grounded aircraft sat in neat rows, red tags fluttering in the breeze. She counted them. 7 multi-million-dollar jets that couldn't fly because someone, somewhere, had failed to deliver the parts needed to fix them. Unacceptable. She walked past the hangars, past the barracks, past the recreation center. Everywhere she looked, she saw the same thing. Potential being wasted. Good people trapped in a bad system. Near the base gym, she paused. Through the windows, she could see personnel working out, running on treadmills, lifting weights, trying to maintain the physical readiness the Navy demanded. At least that was still functioning. She continued walking, circling back toward the administrative buildings. The base chapel was lit from within. Someone was inside, probably praying or seeking a moment of peace. Elena respected that. Faith had carried her through some of the darkest moments of her career. As she walked past the motor pool, she noticed a figure working under the hood of a truck, the same truck she'd seen abandoned earlier. A staff sergeant, judging by the rank on his uniform. He was working alone, long after everyone else had gone home. Elena approached. Need any help? The sergeant looked up, surprised. He was Latino, maybe mid-30s, with grease stains on his hands and exhaustion in his eyes. Nah, I got it, he said. Just trying to get this piece of junk running again before morning. We're down 3 trucks already. Can't afford to lose another one. What's wrong with it? Fuel pump. Should have been replaced months ago. But the parts keep getting delayed. So I'm trying to rebuild this one with spare components from other trucks. He shook his head. It's a band-aid. Won't last more than a few weeks, but it's better than nothing. Elena nodded slowly. You do this a lot? Fix things after hours? Somebody has to. He wiped his hands on a rag. Can't do my job if the equipment doesn't work. So I make it work. What's your name, Sergeant? Ramirez. You? Cross. Just transferred in today. Ramirez gave her a tired smile. Good luck. You're gonna need it. He turned back to the engine, dismissing her politely but firmly. He had work to do, and no time for small talk. Elena walked away, but she made a mental note. Sergeant Ramirez. Motor pool. Works after hours to keep equipment functional because the supply chain is failing him. Another good person trapped in a broken system. Elena's temporary quarters were in the visiting officer housing, a small room with a bed, a desk, and a bathroom. Basic, but clean. She dropped her duffel bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, pulling out a small notebook. For the next hour, she wrote. Personnel observations. System failures. Equipment deficiencies. Morale issues. Leadership gaps. Every detail mattered. Every conversation she'd overheard. Every complaint she'd witnessed. Every problem she'd identified. It all went into the notebook. By the time she finished, she had filled 6 pages. This wasn't just a base with problems. This was a base that had been neglected for so long that the rot had spread into every corner. And the people, good, dedicated people, had learned to accept failure as normal. That was going to change. But not yet. She still had 4 more days of observation. 4 more days to see how deep the problems went. 4 more days to identify the people who still cared, who still fought, who could be counted on when the real work began. Elena closed the notebook and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. In 5 days, she would reveal herself. In 5 days, she would step onto a parade field in dress whites and take command of this base. And then? Then the real work would begin. But tonight, she was just cross. Another anonymous transfer. Another face in the crowd. And that was exactly where she needed to be. Elena's second day at Coronado began before dawn. She woke at 0500, a habit carved into her bones by decades of military service, and went for a run along the perimeter of the base. The morning air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of ocean spray. Her route took her past the flight line, the hangars, the barracks. She ran at an easy pace, watching the base come to life around her. Security patrols changed shifts. Maintenance crews began their morning inspections. Early morning flight operations started with the distant roar of jet engines warming up. Everything looked normal. Routine. But Elena had learned long ago that routine was when you saw the truth. When people weren't performing, for inspections or visitors. When they were just doing their jobs, that's when the real condition of a command revealed itself. She noticed a ground crew taking shortcuts during a pre-flight check. Not dangerous shortcuts, but small omissions that suggested they'd stopped believing in the importance of every detail. She saw a maintenance chief arguing with a supply clerk about parts that should have arrived weeks ago. The argument ended with both men walking away frustrated. Nothing resolved. She watched a junior officer arrive late to formation. And no one said anything. Not because they didn't notice, but because standards had slipped so far that being 10 minutes late didn't even register as a problem anymore. Small things, but small things were how excellence died slowly. One compromise at a time. Until no one remembered what the standard used to be. Elena finished her run, showered, and dressed in the same civilian clothes she'd worn yesterday. She grabbed coffee from the mess, hall burnt and bitter, but caffeinated, and headed to Building 7. The logistics office was already in chaos when she arrived. Major Castillo stood in the center of the room. Phone pressed to her ear. Face tight with barely controlled fury. "I understand that. But understanding doesn't fix my problem," Castillo said through gritted teeth. "I have 18 seconds grounded because you sent us the wrong hydraulic actuators. Wrong part numbers. Wrong specifications. Completely useless. And now you're telling me it'll be another 6 weeks before you can ship the correct parts?" She listened for a moment, jaw clenching. "No. I will not accept 6 weeks. We have operational readiness requirements. We have mission timelines. We have—" She stopped, pulling the phone away from her ear and staring at it in disbelief. "He hung up on me. That son of a bitch hung up on me." She slammed the phone down so hard it cracked. Several people in the office flinched. Lieutenant Kim approached cautiously. "Ma'am, maybe I could try calling the regional." "Don't bother." Castillo cut him off. "Regional will just tell us to file a formal complaint, which will take 8 weeks to process, by which time we'll have missed every deadline anyway." She pressed her palms against her temples. "This is insane. We're a naval air station. Our entire purpose is to keep aircraft flying. And we can't do that because some contractor in Ohio can't read a part number correctly." Elena watched from her desk, saying nothing. But she was already mentally composing the email she would send after she revealed herself to the Regional Supply Command. Heads were going to roll over this. Sergeant Ortega appeared in the doorway, carrying a tablet and looking grim. "Ma'am, we've got another problem. The communications upgrade that was supposed to happen last month got delayed again. 3rd time. And now Comnaverpac is asking why our readiness reports show full capabilities when we're still running on equipment that should have been replaced 2 years ago." Castillo closed her eyes. "Because someone in headquarters reported what they wished was true instead of what actually is true. What do you want me to tell them?" "Tell them." Castillo trailed off, shoulders sagging. "Tell them we're working on it." Ortega nodded and left. But Elena could see the frustration in the sergeant's eyes. Working on it was code for "we've given up, but we're too professional to say that out loud." Elena turned back to her computer and pulled up the supply chain tracking system. She spent the next hour digging through records, cross-referencing orders, tracing shipments. What she found made her jaw tighten. The hydraulic actuators Major Castillo needed, they'd been shipped to the correct address. But someone in receiving had signed for them without checking the part numbers. They'd been sitting in a warehouse on this base for 3 weeks, misidentified and forgotten. The communications equipment? It had arrived on time. But it was flagged as requiring specialized installation, and no one had scheduled the technicians because the authorization paperwork was stuck in some administrator's inbox. Problem after problem, and every single one of them could have been prevented if people were actually paying attention. But they weren't paying attention anymore. They'd been failed by the system so many times that they'd stopped believing things could work correctly. Elena stood and walked over to Major Castillo's desk. "Ma'am, do you have a minute?" Castillo looked up, distracted. "What is it, Cross?" "I think I found your hydraulic actuators." Castillo's expression shifted from exhaustion to sharp focus. "What?" "They were delivered 3 weeks ago. But they were logged incorrectly in receiving. They're in Warehouse C, marked as pending identification." "You're sure?" Elena handed her a printout of the shipping records and the receiving log, with the relevant lines highlighted. "Part numbers match. Shipping date matches. They're here." Castillo stared at the papers, then at Elena. "How did you find this?" "Cross-referenced the supplier's shipping records with our internal inventory database. The system doesn't do it automatically, but if you know where to look." "I've been looking for 3 weeks." Elena kept her voice neutral. "Sometimes it helps to have fresh eyes." Castillo stood abruptly. "Ortega, get down to Warehouse C and verify these part numbers. If Cross is right, I want those actuators in the hands of the maintenance crew within the hour." "Yes, ma'am." Ortega grabbed her keys and headed for the door. Castillo turned back to Elena. "If this pans out, you just saved us 6 weeks and about $500,000 in delayed operations." "Just doing my job, ma'am." But Castillo was still studying her, and Elena could see the question forming again. "Who are you really?" Before Castillo could ask, Lieutenant Kim called out from across the room. "Ma'am, you're going to want to see this." Everyone turned toward the windows. Outside, dark clouds were rolling in from the ocean, moving fast, stacking high. The kind of weather system that didn't show up on morning forecasts because it formed too quickly to predict. Castillo swore under her breath. "That's going to ground flight operations. We've got 3 training sorties scheduled for this afternoon," Kim said, "and a cargo delivery flight coming in from North Island at 1,600. Tell Tower to start pushing up the training departures. Get those birds in the air before the weather closes in. And contact North Island, see if they can delay the cargo flight until this blows over." "Yes, ma'am." But Elena was already pulling up the weather radar on her computer. What she saw made her stomach tighten. This wasn't just a passing storm. This was a fast-moving squall line with embedded thunderstorms, heavy rain, and high winds. It would hit Coronado in less than 2 hours. And once it did, visibility would drop to near zero. Crosswinds would exceed safe landing limits, and any aircraft in the air would be in serious danger. She stood and walked over to the window, watching the horizon. The edge of the storm was already visible, a dark wall of clouds approaching like a tsunami. This was bad. By 1400 hours, the storm was on top of them. Rain hammered against the windows in sheets. Wind howled through gaps in the building's weather stripping. The sky had turned the color of old bruises, purple and gray and black, all churning together. Elena had moved from the logistics office to the base operations center not because she'd been ordered to, but because she'd quietly followed Major Castillo when the situation started escalating. No one questioned her presence. In a crisis, extra hands were always welcome. The operations center was a large room filled with communications equipment, radar displays, and status boards tracking every aircraft and vehicle on the base. Right now, it was controlled chaos. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance, the operations officer, stood at the center console, coordinating with Tower. "Say again, Tower. You're breaking up." The radio crackled with static. "Heavy turbulence. Visibility less than quarter mile. Recommend all non-essential personnel clear the flight line." "Roger that. All non-essential personnel are already clear." "What's the status on the inbound cargo flight?" More static. Then, attempting to contact. No response on primary frequency. Switching to backup. Vance's face went pale. They've lost contact with the cargo bird. Trying to re-establish now, ma'am. Across the room, a radar operator called out. I've got intermittent returns, bearing 280. Distance 40 miles. Could be the cargo flight, but the signal's breaking up. Elena moved closer to the radar display, watching the flickering dot that represented an aircraft somewhere out in that storm. She'd seen this before in the Persian Gulf, during a typhoon, off the coast of Japan, in the North Atlantic, during winter operations. She knew what happened when communications failed and weather turned deadly. People died. If that cargo aircraft couldn't establish reliable contact with the tower, if they couldn't get accurate weather updates and landing vectors, they'd be flying blind into a storm that could tear them apart. The radio crackled again. Coronado Tower. This is Navy Cargo 714. Experiencing heavy turbulence. Request immediate landing clearance. Navy Cargo 714. Coronado Tower. Be advised. Weather below minimums. Recommend divert to North Island or Miramar. Negative. Fuel state critical. Divert not an option. Request priority landing clearance. The room went silent. Lieutenant Commander Vance looked at the radar, at the weather display, at the status boards. Her face was tight with the kind of decision no officer ever wanted to make. If she cleared them to land in these conditions, she was risking the aircraft and crew. If she ordered them to divert, and they ran out of fuel, she was condemning them. Tower, what's your assessment? Vance asked. The tower operator's voice came back strained. Ma'am, visibility is near zero. Crosswinds gusting to 40 knots. We've got lightning in the vicinity. It's not safe. Can they make it? A pause. Then, quietly. I don't know, ma'am. Vance closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them, her voice was steady. Clear them for landing. Emergency equipment on standby. Notify medical. And pray. Yes, ma'am. Elena watched the radar screen. The flickering dot was getting closer. 35 miles. 30 miles. 25. But the signal kept disappearing for seconds at a time, swallowed by interference from the storm. And then the primary radar went down. The screen flickered, filled with static, and went dark. What the hell? The radar operator frantically worked his controls. Primary system just crashed. Switching to the backup system came online. But the display was degraded. Lower resolution. Less reliable. Prone to ghost returns. I've lost positive tracking on the cargo flight, the operator said, voice rising. I've got 3 possible contacts, but I can't confirm which one is them. Tower, do you have visual? Vance demanded. Negative. Visibility is too low. We're completely blind. Vance turned to her team. Options. Give me options. One of the communications specialists spoke up. We could try to guide them in on backup radio frequency, but without reliable radar, we're guessing at their position. Not good enough. Another voice. We could tell them to climb above the storm and wait it out. They don't have the fuel. The room was spiraling into panic. Elena could see it in the faces around her, people who wanted to help but didn't know how. People who had been let down by failing equipment and broken systems so many times that they no longer trusted their ability to handle a crisis. And in the middle of it all was Lieutenant Commander Vance, a competent officer drowning under the weight of a decision that could kill people. Elena made a choice. She stepped forward, voice calm and clear. Lieutenant Commander Vance. Vance turned, looking at her with confusion. Who are you? Right now. Someone who can help. The backup radar system has a manual calibration mode. It's not automated, but if you know how to use it, you can filter out most of the interference and get a cleaner track. How do you know that? Because I've done it before. Elena moved to the radar console. May I? The operator looked at Vance. Vance hesitated for only a second, then nodded. Elena's fingers moved across the controls with practiced precision. She'd used this exact system in older AN SPN-43 during her first deployment as a junior officer. It was outdated, temperamental, and half the Navy had phased it out years ago. But Coronado was still using it because budget constraints and bureaucratic delays had prevented the upgrade. She adjusted frequencies, tweaked gain settings, compensated for ground clutter. The display flickered, stabilized, and suddenly the picture was clearer. One solid contact, bearing 275, distance 18 miles. That's them, Elena said. Navy Cargo 714. Their off-course probably got pushed south by the crosswinds. If they maintain current heading, they're going to overshoot the runway by 2 miles. Vance stared at the screen. Can you track them all the way in? Yes. But you need to get them back on approach vector. Tower needs to guide them onto a corrected heading. 273 should do it. Vance grabbed the radio. Tower, this is Ops. Vector Navy Cargo 714 to heading 273. They're off course and need immediate correction. Roger Ops. Navy Cargo 714 Coronado Tower, turn left heading 273. Advise when steady. The radio crackled. Grr. Turning to 273. Conditions deteriorating. Need landing clearance. Now. Elena watched the radar. The contact began to shift. Slowly correcting course. They're responding. 12 miles out. Descending. But the display flickered again. The system was struggling to maintain lock. I'm losing them, the operator said, voice tight. Elena's hands moved faster. She rerouted power from secondary systems, prioritized the tracking algorithm, shut down non-essential processes. The display stabilized barely. Signals weak but holding. 10 miles. 8 miles. Vance was on the radio now, coordinating directly with the tower. Talk them down. Give me altitude, airspeed, everything. The tower operator's voice came through, strained but professional. Navy Cargo 714. You are 6 miles from touchdown. Maintain current heading. Begin descent to 800 feet. Winds are 320 at 35, gusting to 42. OP. Descending to 800. We're getting hammered. Elena watched the altitude readout on the radar. They were coming in too fast, descending too quickly. They're high and hot. Tower needs to tell them to reduce airspeed and adjust descent rate. Vance relayed the information. The tower responded immediately. 5 miles. 4 miles. The aircraft was fighting crosswinds that kept trying to push it off course. Elena could see it on the radar, tiny corrections, constant adjustments, the pilot struggling to keep the plane aligned with a runway they couldn't even see. 3 miles. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one. The backup radar flickered. The screen filled with static for a brief, terrifying moment. Don't lose them. Vance breathed. Elena's fingers flew across the controls. She rerouted again, compensated again, pushed the system to its absolute limits. The display cleared. 2 miles. They're on glide path. Airspeed good. Altitude good. Elena's voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. 1 mile. Half mile. Tower. Do you have visual? Negative. Wait. Wait. I've got lights. I see them. Talk them down. Navy Cargo 714. You are on center line. On glide path. Continue approach. You're cleared to land. Visual. On the runway. Continuing. The radar showed the contact merging with the runway marker. For a moment, everything hung in balance. Then the tower operator's voice came through, flooded with relief. Cargo 714 is down. Touchdown confirmed. They're safe. The operations center erupted in cheers. People clapped, laughed, hugged each other. The tension that had been suffocating the room for the past 20 minutes evaporated in an instant. But Lieutenant Commander Vance wasn't celebrating. She was staring at Elena. Who the hell are you? Elena stepped back from the radar console, her expression calm. Just someone who's used that system before. That was master-level radar operation. I've got specialists who couldn't have done what you just did. Around them, the cheering had started to fade. People were noticing the conversation. Turning to look. Vance's eyes narrowed. Cross, right? That's what Castillo called you? Yes, ma'am. Where did you serve before this? Elena chose her words carefully. Various postings. Different systems. That's not an answer. Before Elena could respond, Major Castillo pushed through the crowd. Cross? What are you doing in here? Helping. Elena replied simply. Castillo looked at Vance. At the radar. At Elena. What did I miss? Your transfer just talked down a cargo flight through a storm using a radar system that barely works. With more skill than I've seen from officers with twice her experience. Vance crossed her arms. So I'll ask again. Who are you? The room had gone quiet now. Everyone was listening. Elena met Vance's eyes. She could end this right now. She could reveal herself. Pull rank. Take command of the situation. But she still had 3 days left. 3 days to see how deep the problems went. 3 days to identify more people like Castillo and Ortega and Ramirez. The ones who still fought. Who still cared. Who could be counted on. So instead, she said quietly, I'm someone who believes good people deserve systems that work. And when the systems fail, someone has to step up. It wasn't an answer, but it was true. Vance studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. Keep your secrets for now. But you and I are going to have a conversation later. Yes, ma'am. The crowd began to disperse, returning to their stations. The crisis was over. Operations were returning to normal. But Elena could feel eyes on her as she walked back toward the logistics office. Whispers followed her through the corridors. Did you see what she did? How did she know how to use that system? Who is she? The question was spreading. And Elena knew she couldn't hide in plain sight much longer. The storm passed by evening. Leaving, the base soaked and wind-battered but intact. Flight operations resumed. The cargo that had nearly been lost was unloaded and distributed. Life went on. But Elena's cover was cracking. She returned to the logistics office to find Major Castillo waiting at her desk, arms crossed, expression unreadable. My office. Now. Elena followed her into the small, cluttered space. Castillo closed the door and turned to face her. I did some digging, Castillo said. Your transfer orders are vague. Too vague. No previous duty stations listed. No service record attached. Just administrative support. Temporary assignment. That's not normal. Elena said nothing. Then I called Lieutenant Commander Webb in personnel. Asked him about you. He told me the same thing, vague orders, minimal information. But the authorization came from way up the chain. Naval Pack level. Castillo stepped closer. So I'm going to ask you directly. Who are you? Elena weighed her options. She could deflect again. She could lie. Or she could trust that Castillo was smart enough to handle the truth. I'm exactly who my orders say I am. Elena said carefully. Someone here to observe how this base operates. Someone who wanted to see things as they really are. Without the performance people put on when senior leadership visits. Castillo's eyes widened. You're the new CO. In 3 days. You've been here undercover. This whole time. Yes. Castillo sat down heavily in her chair. Processing. Why? Because Coronado has problems that don't show up in reports. Because good officers like you are burning out trying to hold together a system that's been neglected for years. Because I needed to see it for myself before I could fix it. You could have just asked. Would you have told me the truth? If an admiral showed up in dress whites and asked how are things really going, would you have said we're drowning and no one cares? Castillo was silent for a moment. Then she laughed short. Bitter, but with a hint of respect. No. I would have said, everything's fine, ma'am, and kept my frustrations to myself. Exactly. So what happens now? Now, I keep observing. I have 3 more days. And then I take command, and we start fixing this place. Castillo nodded slowly. Does anyone else know? Not yet. But after today, people are asking questions. You saved that flight crew. You probably saved the aircraft, too. People are going to want to know how some random transfer has that level of skill. Elena sighed. I know. I'm trying to stay under the radar a little longer, but you can't help yourself. Castillo smiled faintly. You see a problem, you fix it. Even if it means blowing your cover. Something like that. For what it's worth. Ma'am. And I'm calling you ma'am now because I know who you are. I'm glad you're here. This place needs someone who gives a damn. There are people here who still give a damn. You. Ortega. Ramirez, in the motor pool. Lieutenant Kim, the tower operators who talked that plane down. The problem isn't the people. It's the system. Can you fix it? Elena's eyes hardened with determination. Watch me. That night, Elena didn't go straight back to her quarters. She walked the base again, this time with different eyes. She stopped by the motor pool. Sergeant Ramirez was still there, working under the same truck. You ever go home? Elena asked. He looked up, surprised to see her. Could ask you the same thing. Fair point. She watched him work for a moment. The parts you need for that fuel pump. They're in warehouse B. Misidentified, but they're there. Ramirez froze. How do you know that? I looked. You should have them by tomorrow morning. Who are you? Elena smiled faintly. Someone who's tired of watching good people work twice as hard because the system fails them. She walked away before he could ask more questions. Next stop. The communications hub. The night shift was on duty 3 technicians, maintaining the equipment that kept the base connected to the rest of the fleet. The senior tech, a petty officer named Harris, looked up when Elena entered. Help you? Just checking on the systems after the storm. Everything still operational? Barely. We've got backups for the backups. But it's all held together with prayers and baling wire. He gestured at the equipment racks. Half this stuff should have been replaced 5 years ago. Elena examined the racks, making mental notes. What would you need to bring this up to standard? Harris laughed. You got a few $1 million lying around. Let's say I did. What's the priority list? He thought she was joking, but when he saw her serious expression, he grabbed a tablet and started listing equipment. Primary router needs upgrading. We need redundant power supplies. The antenna array is corroded from salt air. And don't even get me started on the cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Elena listened, memorized every word, and thanked him when he finished. Why do you care? Harris asked. Because someone should. By the time Elena made it back to her quarters, it was past midnight. She pulled out her notebook and added 6 more pages of observations. Equipment failures, supply chain breakdowns, personnel who cared but couldn't succeed because the system was broken. And underneath it all, something else. People were starting to figure out who she was. Tomorrow would be interesting. She lay down, stared at the ceiling, and thought about the cargo flight. About Lieutenant Commander Vance's moment of hesitation. About the radar system that should have been replaced years ago but wasn't. About how close they'd come to losing people because bureaucracy and budget cuts had been prioritized over operational readiness. That was going to change. All of it was going to change. Day 3 began with whispers. Elena heard them as she walked through the base. She saw people pointing, watched conversations stop when she passed. Word had spread about what happened in the operations center. The mysterious transfer who knew things she shouldn't know. Who had skills that didn't match her paperwork. Who moved through the base like someone who'd done this before at a much higher level. When she entered the logistics office, the usual morning chaos was muted. People looked up when she walked in. Major Castillo gave her a brief nod acknowledgement, respect, solidarity. Sergeant Ortega approached her desk. Ma'am. She caught herself. I mean, cross. Got a minute? They stepped into a quiet corner. People are talking. Ortega said quietly. About yesterday. About you. Some of the NCOs think you might be an inspector. Others think you're some kind of specialist sent to evaluate us. What do you think? Ortega smiled slightly. I think you're someone who's been in command before. The way you moved yesterday in ops, that wasn't luck. That was experience. Elena didn't confirm or deny. I don't know who you are. Ortega continued. But I hope you're someone with the authority to actually fix things. Because we're good people. Trying to do a good job. And we're failing. Not because we're incompetent, but because we've been set up to fail. 2 more days, Elena said quietly. Then things change. Ortega studied her face. Then nodded. I'll spread the word. Quietly. The people who still care will be ready. She walked away, leaving Elena standing alone. 2 more days. Then the real work would begin. But first, she needed to survive the growing scrutiny without revealing herself too soon. The scrutiny came in the form of Commander James Hendricks. Elena didn't know who he was when he walked into the logistics office at 1000 hours. She just saw a senior officer in working khakis, ribbons indicating extensive service, expressions suggesting he was used to being obeyed without question. Where's Major Castillo? He asked the room at large. Castillo emerged from her office. Right here, sir. What can I do for you? I'm looking for someone named Cross. Administrative transfer. Elena's stomach tightened. She stood. I'm Cross, sir. Hendricks turned to look at her, eyes narrowing as he assessed. Commander James Hendricks, Executive Officer. I need to speak with you. My office. Now. He didn't wait for a response. Just turned and walked out. Castillo shot Elena a worried glance. But there was nothing to be done. Elena followed Hendricks out of the building and across the quad to the command building. His office was on the 2nd floor, larger than most, decorated with plaques and photos from a long career. He closed the door behind them and gestured to a chair. Sit. Elena sat. Hendricks remained standing, arms crossed. I've been hearing stories about you. Yesterday in the operations center. You took control of a crisis situation that had one of my best officers stumped. You operated a radar system with expertise that should take years to develop. And then you walked away. Like it was nothing. I helped where I could. Sir. Don't give me that. I've been in the Navy for 26 years. I know the difference between someone who's helpful and someone who's running an operation. You weren't helping, you were commanding. Elena said nothing. Your service record is classified above my clearance level. Your transfer orders came from Comnaverpac. And Major Castillo refuses to answer my questions about you. Which tells me she knows something I don't. He leaned forward. So I'm going to ask you directly, and I expect the truth. Who the hell are you? Elena met his eyes. This was the moment. She could deflect, but that would only make things worse. Or she could trust that Hendricks was professional enough to keep a secret for 2 more days. Rear Admiral Elena Cross. She said quietly. I'm assuming command of this base in 48 hours. Hendricks froze. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then he straightened, his posture shifting from confrontational to professional. Why the subterfuge? Because I needed to see how this base operates when no admiral is watching. I needed to understand the problems from the inside before I could fix them from the top. Hendricks processed this, his expression shifting through surprise, understanding, and finally a grim sort of respect. You've been here 3 days. Yes, sir. And you've seen enough? More than enough. He walked to the window, looking out over the base. You probably think we're incompetent. No, sir. I think you're under-resourced, under-supported, and drowning in a bureaucracy that prioritizes paperwork over people. I think the personnel on this base are competent and dedicated. I think the system is what's failing, not the people. Hendricks turned back to face her. Can you fix it? That's why I'm here. He nodded slowly. What do you need from me? 48 hours of silence. I need 2 more days to finish my observations. And then, when I take command, I need your honest assessment of what's broken and what we need to do to fix it. You'll have it. He extended his hand. Welcome to Coronado, Admiral. For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. Elena shook his hand. Thank you, Commander. That means more than you know. Word continued to spread, but now it was controlled. Hendricks kept the secret. Castillo kept the secret. Ortega kept the secret. But the speculation grew. By the end of day 3, nearly everyone on the base had heard some version of the story. The new transfer, who saved a cargo flight, who knew systems she shouldn't know, who moved with the confidence of someone far more senior than her paperwork suggested. Some thought she was an inspector sent to evaluate the base. Others thought she was some kind of specialist on a classified assignment. No one guessed the truth. Except the people who needed to know. That night, Elena sat in her quarters and finished her report. 15 pages detailing every problem she'd identified. Every equipment failure. Every supply chain breakdown. Every person who was still fighting to do their job despite a system designed to make them fail. And underneath the problems, she wrote the solutions. Not vague recommendations. Specific, actionable fixes. Equipment to be replaced. Processes to be streamlined. Personnel to be recognized and promoted. Budget allocations to be adjusted. She had seen enough. She had learned enough. In 48 hours, she would step onto a parade field in dress whites. She would accept command of this base. And then the real work would begin. But tonight, she was still just cross. Still anonymous. Still watching. Still preparing for the moment when everything would change. Day 4 arrived with a tension that hung over Coronado like the marine layer that rolled in every morning. Elena could feel it as she walked through the base, people watching her differently now. Conversations stopping when she passed. Questions hovering in the air that no one quite dared to ask out loud. She spent the morning in the logistics office, processing her final requisitions and watching Major Castillo manage the organized chaos with the efficiency of someone who had learned to do more with less. Lieutenant Kim was growing into his role, making fewer mistakes, asking better questions. Sergeant Ortega moved through the room like a conductor, keeping everything flowing even when the system tried to fail. These were good people. And tomorrow, Elena would finally be in a position to give them the support they deserved. At lunch, she sat in the mess hall and listened to the conversations around her. The complaints were the same ones she'd heard on day 1: equipment failures, supply delays, bureaucratic nightmares. But now, underneath the frustration, there was something else. A faint thread of hope. "Did you hear the new CO takes command tomorrow?" Someone said at the next table. "Yeah. Some hotshot admiral. Youngest rear admiral in recent history, supposedly. Think she'll actually change anything?" A pause. Then, "Maybe. Did you hear what happened with that cargo flight during the storm? Word is some transfer managed to talk them down when our own systems were failing. Maybe the new admiral is bringing in people who actually know what they're doing." Elena kept her expression neutral, but internally, she smiled. The pieces were falling into place. That afternoon, she made her final rounds. She visited the motor pool and found Sergeant Ramirez installing the fuel pump she'd helped him locate. He nodded to her in silent gratitude, still not sure who she was, but knowing she'd made his job possible. She stopped by the communications hub and spoke with Petty Officer Harris, who was compiling his equipment priority list in earnest now. As if someone might actually listen. She walked the flight line and counted the aircraft. Still 7 grounded. But the parts for 3 of them were finally in the right hands, thanks to her intervention. By next week, they'd be flying again. Small victories. But they mattered. As the sun set on her 4th day, Elena stood at the edge of the base, looking out over the Pacific Ocean. The water was calm, reflecting the orange and pink of the dying light. In the distance, she could see the silhouettes of Navy ships moving along the horizon: destroyers, cruisers, the backbone of American naval power. She had commanded ships like those. She had led strike groups through dangerous waters. She had made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would take command not of a ship, but of a base. Not of a crew at sea, but of a community on land. And the battles she would fight wouldn't be against enemies across the ocean, but against complacency, neglect, and the creeping rot of a system that had forgotten its purpose. She pulled out her phone and made one final call. "Admiral Harrison," a voice answered. "Sir, this is Elena Cross." I wanted to give you my final report before the ceremony tomorrow. Admiral Richard Harrison was the commander of Naval Air Forces Pacific, her direct superior, and the man who had approved her unconventional approach to taking command. I'm listening, he said. Elena spent the next 20 minutes outlining everything she'd discovered: the equipment failures, the supply chain breakdowns, the good people trapped in a broken system, the potential she saw underneath all the problems. When she finished, Harrison was silent for a moment. That bad? He finally asked. That bad, Elena confirmed. But fixable. I'll need budget authorization for equipment replacements. I'll need personnel support to fill critical gaps. And I'll need higher command to stop treating Coronado like an afterthought. You'll have it. I'll make sure of it. Elena? Yes, sir? When I approved your request to go in undercover, I wasn't sure it was worth the risk. But what you've learned in 4 days it would have taken 6 months to extract through official channels. Good work. Thank you, sir. See you tomorrow. She hung up and stood for a moment longer, watching the ocean. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, she allowed herself one last moment as nobody. One last moment of anonymity, before the weight of command settled back onto her shoulders where it belonged. Day 5. The morning of the change of command ceremony. Elena woke at 0430 and went through her pre-ceremony routine with the precision of ritual. A final run around the base 6 miles. Easy pace, letting her mind settle into the calm focus she would need for the day ahead. A shower. A careful breakfast in her quarters, not the mess hall. And then, finally, the uniform. Her dress whites hung in the closet, still in the garment bag they'd traveled in. She pulled them out slowly, reverently. The jacket was crisp and perfectly tailored. The ribbons were arranged in precise rows, 23 years of service compressed into colored fabric. Combat Action Ribbon, Navy Commendation Medal, Meritorious Service Medal with Gold Star. The list went on. And on each shoulder, the stars, 2 silver stars, each one representing the rank she'd earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The rank she'd hidden for 4 days. The rank she would finally wear openly again. Elena dressed slowly, checking every detail. The uniform had to be perfect, not out of vanity, but out of respect for the ceremony, for the command she was about to assume, for the people who would be watching. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself compared to the woman who had arrived 4 days ago in jeans and a hoodie. The transformation was complete. She was Admiral Elena Cross again, and it was time. The parade field at Naval Air Station Coronado was a wide expanse of perfectly manicured grass bordered by palm trees that swayed in the morning breeze. Temporary bleachers had been erected along one side for distinguished guests. Other admirals, local officials, representatives from the mayor's office. The base honor guard stood at attention in their dress uniforms, rifles gleaming in the sunlight. And in formation across the field, the entire base personnel stood in perfect ranks. Sailors in their dress blues, officers in their dress whites, Marines in their dress uniforms. More than 3,000 people, all standing at attention, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Among them, Major Rachel Castillo, whose logistics office had become Elena's window into the base's struggles. Sergeant Maria Ortega, whose competence and dedication had kept that office running. Lieutenant Kim, who was learning what good leadership looked like. Sergeant Ramirez from the motor pool, still not entirely sure why he'd been invited to stand in the front row. Petty Officer Harris from communications, holding his equipment priority list in his pocket like a talisman. And Commander James Hendricks, the executive officer, who stood near the podium with an expression that mixed professional neutrality with barely concealed anticipation. At 0900 hours exactly, the ceremony began. The master of ceremonies, a captain from the base protocol office, stepped to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, officers and enlisted personnel, distinguished guests, please rise for the arrival of the official party. The base band struck up a march. The crowd rose as one. From the command building, the official party emerged. The outgoing commanding officer, Captain Robert Chen, who had managed Coronado adequately but without distinction for the past 2 years, walked with stiff formality. Behind him, other senior officers from the region. And then, emerging from the side entrance, where she'd been waiting, Admiral Elena Cross stepped into the sunlight. For a moment, nothing happened. The crowd was looking toward the main entrance, expecting the new Admiral to arrive in a staff car or from the VIP area. But Elena walked across the parade field from the same direction personnel entered every day. Not from some protected, elevated space, but from among them. And as she walked, people began to recognize her. The first was a young sailor standing in the second rank, one of the men Elena had run past during her morning jogs. His eyes went wide. His mouth opened slightly. Then, Major Castillo saw her. Elena watched her face go through a series of expressions. Confusion, recognition, shock, and finally a fierce, proud smile. Sergeant Ortega actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The recognition spread like ripples across water. Row by row, section by section, people realized that the woman in the Admiral's uniform walking toward the podium was the same woman who had been filing paperwork in the logistics office. The same woman who had saved a cargo flight. The same woman who had walked among them for 4 days, invisible and watching. Commander Hendricks, standing near the podium, allowed himself the briefest smile. The band continued playing, but underneath the music, a sound was building: whispers, sharp intakes of breath, muttered exclamations of disbelief. Elena reached the podium and took her place beside Captain Chen. She stood at attention, shoulders back, eyes forward, expression calm and composed. The master of ceremonies cleared his throat, his voice slightly unsteady. "Ladies and gentlemen, Rear Admiral Elena Cross, assuming command of Naval Air Station Coronado." The whispers became a roar. Not loud military discipline held, but the energy was unmistakable. 3,000 people processing the same realization simultaneously. She was here the whole time. She saw everything. She knows. The ceremony proceeded according to protocol. Captain Chen gave his farewell address, polite, professional, filled with the standard phrases about honor and service. He read the orders transferring command. He saluted the base colors. He shook Elena's hand. And then it was her turn to speak. Elena stepped to the microphone. For a moment, she just stood there, looking out over the assembled personnel. She found familiar faces in the crowd: Castillo, Ortega, Ramirez, Harris, Kim, Lieutenant Commander Vance from the operations center, the tower operators who had talked down the cargo flight, the young sailors who smoked outside the mess hall, the maintenance crews who worked after hours. All of them watching her now with expressions ranging from shock to curiosity to cautious hope. She took a breath and began. 4 days ago, I walked through that gate, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a duffel bag. The guard barely looked at me. The Marine beside him made a joke about hoping I could file paperwork faster than the last transfer. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the formation. I spent the next 4 days working in the logistics office, processing requisitions, tracking shipments, listening to phone calls where good percentage people begged suppliers to deliver parts that were already 6 weeks late. Major Castillo's eyes were glistening now, but she stood rigid at attention. I walked through this base and saw equipment that should have been replaced years ago, still in service because budget cuts and bureaucratic delays had been prioritized over your ability to do your jobs. I saw vehicles sitting broken in parking lots while the sergeants who should have been able to fix them worked after hours, cannibalizing parts, doing everything they could with nothing. Sergeant Ramirez's jaw tightened. He understood now why she'd known where to find those fuel pump components. I sat in the operations center and watched a cargo flight nearly get lost in a storm because our radar system a system that should have been upgraded 5 years ago, failed at exactly the wrong moment. Lieutenant Commander Vance stood in the officer section, arms at her sides, staring at Elena with an expression that mixed embarrassment and respect. And through all of it, I saw something else. I saw people who still cared. People who showed up every day and fought to do excellent work, despite a system designed to make them fail. I saw sergeants working midnight hours because they refused to let their sailors down. I saw majors coordinating with suppliers on their personal cell phones because the official channels had stopped working. I saw junior officers staying late to untangle bureaucratic messes that never should have existed in the first place. Her voice grew stronger, carrying across the field with the weight of absolute conviction. I saw dedication. I saw competence. I saw sacrifice. What I did not see was failure. Because you, all of you, are not failing. The system failed you. And that ends today. The silence was profound now. 3,000 people barely breathing. I spent 4 days invisible because I needed to see the truth. I needed to understand what was really happening here when no admiral was watching. And now I know. You are good people trying to do an impossible job with insufficient support. That is not acceptable. Not to me. Not anymore. Elena paused, letting the words sink in. As of today, things change. We're replacing the radar system, full upgrade, funded and authorized. We're fixing the supply chain. I've already contacted regional command. And several heads are going to roll over the incompetence you've been dealing with. We're getting the parts you need, the equipment you deserve, and the support you should have had all along. She saw hope kindle in faces across the formation. But more than that, we're changing the culture. No more accepting good enough when excellence is possible. No more bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. No more allowing good people to burn out because the system doesn't care. Elena's voice softened slightly, but lost none of its intensity. I walked among you because I needed to know who you really were. Now I need you to know who I really am. I'm not an admiral who sits in an office and issues orders without understanding their impact. I'm not a leader who demands excellence without providing the tools to achieve it. I'm someone who believes that leadership means serving the people you command, not the other way around. She looked directly at Major Castillo. Major Rachel Castillo. Step forward. Castillo's eyes went wide. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then she marched forward. Boots striking the ground with parade ground precision. She stopped 3 paces from the podium and saluted sharply. Elena returned the salute, then stepped around the podium to face her directly. Major Castillo, you have spent 2 years holding together a logistics operation that should have collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction. You have worked 18-hour days. You have begged, negotiated, and fought for every requisition, every shipment, every spare part. You have done this without complaint, without recognition, and without the support you deserved. Castillo's jaw was trembling now, but she held her composure. Effective immediately, you are promoted to lieutenant colonel, and you will lead the base-wide logistics reform initiative with full authority to redesign every process that isn't working. I want your recommendations on my desk within 30 days. And I want them implemented within 90. We will fix this. Starting with you. Applause erupted, not scattered, but immediate and thunderous. Personnel in the formation clapped despite protocol. The distinguished guests in the bleachers rose to their feet. Castillo saluted again. Tears streaming down her face now. Not bothering to hide them. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. She returned to formation, and Elena called the next name. Staff Sergeant Miguel Ramirez. Front and center. Ramirez looked like he'd been struck by lightning. The Marines around him had to physically nudge him forward. He approached the podium. His dress uniform. Immaculate, but his hands still bearing the faint stains of engine grease that never quite washed away. Staff Sergeant Ramirez, you work after hours. You cannibalize parts. You rebuild fuel pumps that should have been replaced. You do all of this because you refuse to let your equipment fail. Even when the system fails you. Ramirez stood at rigid attention. Overwhelmed. You are promoted to Sergeant First Class, effective immediately. And you will oversee the motor pool modernization program. You know what we need. You know what works. You will have budget authority and procurement priority. Make it happen. Ramirez's voice was thick when he responded. Yes, ma'am. I won't let you down. You never have, Sergeant. That's why you're getting this chance. As Ramirez returned to formation, Elena continued. Petty Officer First Class David Harris. Step forward. Harris came forward, looking stunned. Petty Officer Harris, you and your communications team keep this base connected to the entonoment fleet using equipment that should be in a museum. You've documented every failure, every vulnerability, every gap in capability, and you've done it while maintaining operational readiness despite impossible circumstances. Elena pulled a folded document from her jacket pocket. This is your equipment priority list. I read it. I forwarded it to Comnaverpac. It's been approved. Every item. Full funding. You'll oversee the implementation of the Communications Modernization Program. Harris actually staggered slightly. Ma'am. All of it. All of it. And if you find something we missed, you tell me directly. No more watching critical systems fail because budget clerks don't understand operational necessity. Yes, ma'am. Harris's salute was crisp despite the shock. Elena turned back to face the full formation. These three people represent what is best about this base. Dedication, competence, refusal to accept failure. They are not exceptional because they're superhuman. They're exceptional because they're exactly what every person in this formation should be when given the right support. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across 3,000 faces. And now, you have it. The support. The equipment. The leadership that understands what you're dealing with. Because I've lived it with you. Elena's voice dropped. Became quieter, but somehow more powerful. I will never ask you to do something I wouldn't do myself. I will never issue an order without understanding how it affects the people carrying it out. And I will never accept a system that makes good people fail. She straightened to full attention. From this day forward, we don't just meet standards. We set them. Naval Air Station Coronado will become the model every other base aspires to match. Not because I demand it, but because you, every single one of you, deserve the chance to show what you're capable of when the system works with you instead of against you. The silence that followed was electric, and then, from somewhere in the formation, a single voice called out, "Hoo-yah!" It was picked up immediately by others. Hoo-yah! The traditional Navy expression of motivation and enthusiasm spread like wildfire through the ranks. Hoo-yah! 3,000 voices, thundering across the parade field, shaking the air itself. Elena let it continue for a moment, then raised her hand. Silence fell instantly. This base has been overlooked, undervalued, neglected. That ends now. We will be excellent. We will be ready. We will be the base that every sailor wants to serve on and every command wants to emulate. She took a breath. And it starts today. With me. With you. Together. Elena stepped back and saluted the formation. For a moment, no one moved. And then, slowly, deliberately, Commander James Hendricks stepped forward. His right hand came up in a salute that was sharp, precise, and held just a fraction longer than protocol required. His eyes met Elena's, and in them, she saw respect. Real respect. Earned respect. She returned his salute, and the floodgates opened. Major Castillo, now Lieutenant Colonel Castillo, saluted, her face still wet with tears but her expression fierce with determination. Sergeant Ramirez saluted, his hand steady despite the emotion coursing through him. Lieutenant Kim saluted. Sergeant Ortega saluted. Petty Officer Harris saluted. And then the entire formation moved as one. 3,000 hands rose simultaneously. 3,000 boots struck the ground in perfect synchronization, a sound like thunder rolling across the field. The salute wave spread outward from the front ranks to the back, from the center to the edges, until every person on that parade field stood with their hand raised in recognition of the Admiral who had walked among them, seen them truly, and promised to fight for them. The sound was overwhelming. Not cheering, this was more profound than that. This was the sound of hope being reborn, of pride returning, of a command that had forgotten what excellence felt like. Suddenly remembering, Elena stood at attention, returning every salute she could see. Her own eyes burning now, but her composure absolute. This was what leadership looked like. Not commanding from above, but serving from within. Not demanding respect, but earning it through understanding and action. The bass band began playing the Navy hymn, Eternal Father, Strong to Save. The music swelled, mixing with the sound of boots and the rustle of 3,000 uniforms moving in perfect unison. In the bleachers, the distinguished guests had risen to their feet. Admiral Harrison, her superior, stood with his hand over his heart, a slight smile on his face. He had approved her unorthodox approach. Now he was seeing the results. The ceremony concluded with the traditional passing of command, the base colors transferred from Captain Chen to Admiral Cross. She accepted them with the same steady hands that had once guided warships through combat zones. And when the final notes of the hymn faded away, when the last salute had been returned, Elena stood alone at the podium for a moment, looking out over her command. Her base, her people, her responsibility. She had seen their struggles. She understood their challenges. And now she had the authority to fix what was broken. The hard work was just beginning. But, for the first time in years, Naval Air Station Coronado believed that excellence was possible again. The reception following the ceremony was held in the Officers' Club, a large space with windows overlooking the Pacific. The room was packed with personnel wanting to meet their new commanding officer, now that they knew who she really was. Elena moved through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, answering questions. But more importantly, she was listening, still learning. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vance approached, looking both embarrassed and impressed. "Ma'am, I owe you an advance apology. When you were in my operations center, I should have recognized." Elena cut her off gently. "You were focused on saving a flight crew. That's exactly what you should have been doing. No apology necessary. Still, if you'd known, you might have deferred to my rank instead of trusting your own judgment. You made the right call clearing them to land. You kept your head in a crisis. That's what matters." Vance relaxed slightly. "Thank you, ma'am. How long have you been ops officer here?" 18 months. "You're good at it. But I saw the strain. You're trying to run operations with equipment that barely functions and personnel stretched too thin. That's changing. You'll have what you need within 60 days. Vance's eyes widened. 60 days? Or less. Admiral Harrison is making this base a priority, and I'm not accepting delays. As Vance walked away looking slightly dazed, Lieutenant Colonel Castillo approached with Sergeant Ortega. "Ma'am," Castillo began, then stopped, seeming unsure what to say. Elena smiled. "You're wondering if I meant everything I said out there. Frankly, yes. I've heard promises before. I know. That's why I spent 4 days proving I'm different." Elena's expression turned serious. "Rachel, may I call you Rachel?" "Of course, ma'am." "Rachel, I watched you hold that logistics office together through sheer force of will. You're exhausted. You're running on fumes. And you've probably been doing it for so long that you don't remember what it feels like to have actual support." Castillo's eyes filled again. "That's accurate. It ends now. You're getting 3 additional personnel within the week. Your budget constraints are lifted. And every single stupid bureaucratic barrier I watched you fight through gone. I'm rewriting the base operating instructions personally. If a process doesn't serve operational readiness, it's eliminated." Sergeant Ortega spoke up. "Ma'am, you really read all those reports we filed? All those suggestions that never went anywhere? Every single one. And most of them were excellent. The problem wasn't your ideas. The problem was that no one with authority was listening. I'm listening. And I'm implementing." Sergeant Ramirez appeared, still looking overwhelmed. "Ma'am, about the motor pool program you mentioned, you'll have full procurement authority up to $50,000 per requisition. Anything larger goes through me personally, and I'll approve it within 24 hours if you can justify operational necessity. Which, based on what I saw, you always can. I don't know what to say. Say, you'll fix the problems. That's all I need." As the reception continued, Elena noticed a figure standing alone near the windows, watching the crowd with a calculating expression. Commander Thomas Burke, the base supply officer. the man ultimately responsible for the procurement disasters she'd witnessed. She excused herself from her current conversation and walked over to him. "Commander Burke, we haven't met formally yet." Burke turned, his smile professionally neutral. "Admiral Cross. Congratulations on assuming command. I look forward to working with you." "Do you?" The smile faltered slightly. "Ma'am?" "Commander, I spent 4 days watching your supply system fail repeatedly. Wrong parts delivered, correct parts lost in warehouses, requisitions delayed for months without justification. How long have you been supply officer here?" 3 years, ma'am. 3 years of presiding over systematic dysfunction. Either you're incompetent or you're indifferent. Which is it? Burke's face reddened. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't understand the challenges." "I understand perfectly. I worked in your office. I processed your requisitions. I traced your failures. And what I found was a supply officer who stopped fighting for his people and started protecting his own convenience. That's not fair. You're relieved. Effective, immediately. You'll be reassigned to a staff position at Regional Command, where your inability to do your job won't put operational readiness at risk. Pack your office. You have 72 hours. Burke stared at her, speechless. Around them, conversations had stopped. People were watching. "Ma'am, you can't just—" "I can. And I did." "Dismissed, Commander." Burke opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked away. His career effectively over. Elena turned back to find the entire room watching her. She raised her voice slightly. "Let me be clear about something. I will support, defend, and fight for anyone in this command who is genuinely trying to do their job well, but I will not tolerate incompetence, indifference, or self-serving bureaucracy. Excellence is the standard. Meet it, or find somewhere else to serve." The silence was profound. Then someone in the back of the room started clapping. Others joined. Within seconds, the entire reception was applauding, not polite ceremony applause, but genuine, enthusiastic recognition. They understood now. This wasn't just talk. This was action. Admiral Harrison approached, still clapping, a broad smile on his face. "Admiral Cross, I think you've made your position clear. Just setting expectations, sir. I approve. Burke's been a problem child for years, but no one wanted to deal with the paperwork. You handled it in less than 5 minutes. I don't have time for problem children, sir. I have a base to fix." "About that." Harrison pulled her aside slightly, lowering his voice. "I meant what I said on the phone. You'll have full support from Comnaverpac. Budget. Personnel. Authority to make changes. But Elena, be careful. You're moving fast. You're making enemies in the bureaucracy." "Good. The bureaucracy is part of the problem. Just remember, you can't fix everything by force of will alone. Build allies. Build consensus where you can." Elena nodded. "I will, sir. But where consensus isn't possible, I'll move forward anyway. These people have been waiting too long for someone to actually fix things." "Agreed. Just don't burn yourself out in the first 6 months." "I won't. I've learned from watching what happened here when leaders tried to do everything alone. I'm delegating to competent people and empowering them to act. That's how we'll sustain this." The reception eventually wound down. Personnel returned to their duties. The distinguished guests departed. Elena finally found herself alone in her new office, the commanding officer's suite on the 3rd floor of the administration building. It was larger than she needed, with windows overlooking the parade field where she'd taken command hours earlier. A desk that probably dated back to the 1980s. Bookshelves lined with regulations and manuals that would need updating. Photos of previous commanders on the wall, a tradition she would maintain. She sat down at the desk and powered up the computer. Her inbox was already in excess of flooded 267 unread messages. She began sorting through them methodically. Congratulations from fellow flag officers. Questions from Pentagon staff. Requests for meetings from department heads. And buried in the middle, a message from Major now Lieutenant Colonel Castillo. Subject: Thank you. The body was simple. Ma'am, I don't have words adequate to express what today meant. For the first time in 2 years, I believe we can actually fix this place. Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for caring. We won't let you down. Rachel Elena typed a quick response. You never let anyone down, Rachel. You kept this place running when it should have collapsed. Now we get to find out what you can do with actual support. I'm expecting great things. Elena. She continued working through the emails, responding to the important ones, delegating others, making notes about issues that would require follow-up. By 1900 hours, she'd cleared most of the backlog. A knock on her door. Commander Hendricks stood in the doorway. Got a minute, Admiral? Of course, come in. Hendricks closed the door and sat down across from her desk. For a moment, he just looked at her. That was the most unconventional change of command ceremony I've ever witnessed, he finally said. And I've been to 24 of them. Was it effective? Hell yes, it was effective. The entire base is energized in a way I haven't seen since I arrived here. But Elena, may I call you Elena? In private, yes. Elena, you made a lot of promises today. Big promises. The personnel are counting on you to deliver. I know. That's why I will. It's going to be hard. The bureaucracy will fight you. The budget people will push back. Regional command will have questions about why you're moving so fast. Let them question. I've got Admiral Harrison's support, and I've got the operational necessity to justify every change I'm making. Anyone who wants to slow me down will have to explain why they think Navy personnel should work with broken equipment and inadequate support. Hendricks smiled. You're going to be trouble, aren't you? The best kind of trouble. The kind that actually fixes things. Good. We need that. He stood to leave. Then paused. For what it's worth. I'm glad you're here. This place was dying slowly. Now it's got a chance. We all have a chance. Including you. James. I saw your service record. You're underutilized in this position. We're going to change that. After Hendricks left, Elena sat alone in her office for a few more minutes, looking out over the base as the sun set over the Pacific. The sky turned shades of orange and purple, painting the clouds in colors that reminded her why she loved the Navy, the ocean, the horizon, the endless possibility. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Budget meetings. Personnel reviews. Equipment inspections. Policy rewrites. 1,000 small decisions that would add up to transformation. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had walked among her people. She had seen their struggles. She had understood their challenges. And now she was in position to fix what was broken. The hard part was just beginning. But for the first time in years, Naval Air Station Coronado had hope. And hope, she knew, was the foundation of everything else. 6 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Air Station Coronado as Admiral Elena Cross stepped out of her staff car. She wore her working khakis today, no ceremony, no formal inspection. Just a commanding officer checking on her base. The difference from 6 months ago was staggering. The flight line was active with properly maintained aircraft. All 7 of the jets that had been grounded on her first day were now fully operational. The red tags were gone, replaced by green status indicators. Maintenance crews moved with purpose and efficiency, no longer hampered by missing parts or bureaucratic delays. The motor pool gleamed. Every vehicle was operational, properly maintained, tracked in a new digital system that actually worked. Sergeant First Class Ramirez, now Warrant Officer Ramirez, having been selected for the program, oversaw an operation that other bases were calling for advice on. His maintenance protocols had become the standard across the entire Pacific Fleet. The communications hub had been completely modernized. New equipment, redundant systems, cybersecurity upgrades. Chief Petty Officer Harris, promoted after his exceptional work leading the upgrade, now ran an operation that was used as a training site for communications specialists from across the Navy. But the most important changes weren't the equipment. They were the people. Elena walked into Building 7, the logistics office that had been controlled chaos on her first day. Now it ran like clockwork. Computer screens showed real-time tracking of every requisition. Supply chains functioned smoothly. The backlog that had been measured in hundreds of items was down to 0. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Castillo stood near the center of the room, tablet in hand, directing operations with calm efficiency. But unlike 6 months ago, she wasn't running on fumes. She had a team now. Support, resources, the tools she needed to do her job well. When she saw Elena, her face lit up. "Admiral, we weren't expecting you this morning. Surprise inspections aren't inspections if you know they're coming. How are things?" "Running perfectly. We processed 247 requisitions yesterday. Average completion time, 4.2 hours. 0 errors. 0 delays. Outstanding. How's your team holding up?" "Thriving. We haven't had anyone burn out or request transfer in 5 months. Morale is the highest I've ever seen it." Elena nodded, satisfied. "That's what happens when you give good people the support they deserve. Keep up the excellent work, Rachel." She continued her walk, stopping by various departments. Everywhere she went, she saw the same transformation. Equipment that worked, processes that made sense, personnel who were engaged, motivated, proud of their work. The mess hall food had improved not dramatically, but enough that people actually wanted to eat there. The base gym had been upgraded. The barracks had been renovated. Small things that added up to a base that cared about its people. At 1000 retry F continue hours, Elena walked into the base theater for what had become her monthly town hall meeting. The room was packed, standing room only. Personnel from every department, every rank, every corner of the base. This was something she'd implemented in her first week. Direct access to the commanding officer. No filters, no bureaucracy. Once a month, anyone could come ask questions, raise concerns, suggest improvements. The first town hall had been tentative. People weren't sure if they could really speak freely. But when Elena had taken notes on every suggestion and actually implemented the good ones, word had spread. Now these meetings were standing room only, and the energy was electric. She stepped onto the stage without ceremony. Just walked up and faced her people. "Good morning, Coronado." "Good morning, ma'am." The response was enthusiastic, unified. 6 months ago, I stood on a parade field and told you that things were going to change. That we were going to be excellent. That we were going to become the base every sailor wanted to serve on. She paused. "I think we're getting there." Applause filled the room. "But we're not done. Excellence isn't a destination, it's a continuous process. So tell me, what's working? What's not? What do we need to fix next?" Hands shot up across the room. Elena pointed to a young seaman in the 3rd row. "Ma'am, Seaman Rodriguez. Aviation maintenance. I just wanted to say thank you. 6 months ago, I was ready to leave the Navy. The equipment didn't work, we couldn't get parts, and I felt like I was failing at my job. Now, I love coming to work. We have what we need. We're actually maintaining aircraft instead of just trying to keep them from falling apart. Thank you, Seaman Rodriguez. That's why we're here." Elena pointed to another hand. Lieutenant Sarah Park. Communications. "Ma'am, the new equipment has been incredible, but we're starting to see some integration issues with legacy systems at other bases. Could we get authorization to develop some middleware solutions?" Elena nodded. "Absolutely. Submit your technical requirements to Chief Harris. If it's operationally sound, you'll have approval within 48 hours. Next, Staff Sergeant Chen, Security Forces. "Ma'am, we've seen a significant uptick in morale across the base, which is great. But we're also seeing more personnel staying on base during off hours, using facilities, participating in programs. Our security manning hasn't increased to match. Could we look at adjusting shift schedules or bringing in additional personnel?" "Good catch, Sergeant. That's exactly the kind of second-order effect we need to anticipate. Work with Commander Hendricks on a manning study. If we need more people, we'll get them. I'd rather add security personnel than limit base access during off hours. People deserve to enjoy the facilities they've helped improve." The meeting continued for 90 minutes. Every question received a serious answer. Every concern was noted. Every suggestion was evaluated on its merits. When it ended, personnel left energized, talking among themselves about the changes, the improvements, the sense that their voices actually mattered. Elena stayed behind, reviewing her notes. Commander Hendricks approached, carrying his own tablet full of action items. 17 new initiatives from this morning's meeting, he said. You're going to keep us busy. That's the idea. A base that stops improving starts declining. We don't decline anymore. No, ma'am, we don't. Hendricks smiled. You know, 6 months ago, I wasn't sure if your approach would work. The undercover observation, the rapid changes, the willingness to challenge the bureaucracy. It seemed risky. And now, this base has the highest operational readiness scores in the Pacific Fleet. We have the highest retention rates. We have the highest morale indices. And every other base commander is asking how we did it. We did it by remembering that the mission succeeds or fails based on the people executing it. Take care of the people. Give them what they need. And they'll achieve things you never thought possible. That afternoon, Elena visited the newly renovated Family Support Center. This had been one of her personal priorities, ensuring that not just the sailors, but their families, had the resources they needed. The center now offered childcare, counseling services, financial planning assistance, and employment support for military spouses. The waiting list that used to stretch for weeks was gone. Services were accessible, professional, and genuinely helpful. She spoke with several families, listening to their stories. A wife whose husband had been deployed for months, but felt supported by the base community. A father whose child care concerns had been completely resolved, allowing him to focus on his duties. A young couple, navigating military life for the first time, grateful for the financial counseling that had helped them avoid debt. This was leadership, not just commanding personnel in uniform, but supporting the entire community that made military service possible. As she left the Family Support Center, her phone buzzed. A message from Admiral Harrison. Elena CNO wants a briefing on Coronado's transformation. You've got their attention. Pentagon next month. Be ready to share your playbook. Other bases need what you've built. Richard. Elena smiled. CNO Chief of Naval Operations, the highest-ranking officer in the Navy, wanted to know how she'd turned around a failing base in 6 months. She typed a response. Copy all. I'll bring Castillo, Ramirez, and Harris. They did the work. They should get the recognition. Harrison's reply was immediate. Typical Elena. Taking care of your people before yourself. CNO is specifically interested in your leadership approach. But bringing your team is a good call. Well done. That evening, Elena stood once again at the edge of the base, looking out over the Pacific. The same spot she'd stood 6 months ago, the night before her reveal. But everything was different now. The base behind her was alive with energy. Lights blazed from buildings where people were working late not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because they were engaged in meaningful work. Supported by leadership that cared. Equipped with tools that actually functioned. She heard footsteps behind her. Lieutenant Colonel Castillo approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might be out here, Rachel said, handing her one. You come here a lot. It helps me think. Reminds me why we do this. Elena sipped the coffee. Good coffee. Not the burnt mess from 6 months ago. Even that had improved. Admiral. Elena. Can I ask you something? Always. When you were undercover, when you saw how bad things were, did you ever doubt we could fix it? Elena was quiet for a moment. Honestly? No. I saw the problems clearly. But I also saw the people. And I knew that if we removed the barriers, if we gave you the support and resources you needed, you'd be unstoppable. I was right. We couldn't have done it without you. Yes, you could have. You just needed someone to clear the path. All the excellence, all the dedication, all the competence that was already here. I just made it possible for you to use it. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the water. You know what the best part is? Rachel finally said. For the first time in my career, I'm not burned out. I'm not exhausted. I'm not wondering how long I disstated. Can keep going. I'm actually enjoying my job. And I'm not the only one. That's what you gave us. Not just better equipment or faster processes. You gave us back our passion for the work. Elena felt her throat tighten slightly. This was why she'd spent 4 days walking among her people. This was why she'd endured the scrutiny, the questions, the risk of exposure. Because leadership wasn't about commanding from above, it was about understanding from within. Thank you, Rachel. That means more than you know. There's one more thing. Rachel pulled out her tablet and showed Elena a message. This came through official channels this afternoon. We've been selected to host a fleet-wide leadership conference. 200 officers from across the Pacific are coming here to learn how we transformed this base. They're calling it the Coronado model. Elena read the message, allowing herself a moment of pride. Not for herself, but for her people. For Castillo and Ramirez and Harris, Ortega and Kim, and every sailor who had believed that excellence was possible and worked to achieve it. We'll show them, Elena said quietly. We'll show them that it's not magic. It's not some complicated formula. It's just leadership that actually cares, systems that actually work, and people who are given the chance to be excellent. That's exactly what I told Admiral Harrison when he called to confirm. He laughed and said you'd say something like that. Elena smiled. He knows me too well. The conference took place 6 weeks later. The base theater was filled with commanders, executive officers, and department heads from across the Pacific Fleet. Elena stood on the stage. But she wasn't alone. Beside her were Lieutenant Colonel Castillo, Warrant Officer Ramirez, Chief Petty Officer Harris, and Sergeant Major Ortega. Good morning, Elena began. Thank you for coming to Coronado. You're here because someone told you. We've achieved something remarkable, transforming a failing video base into a model of excellence in 6 months. They're right. But the remarkable part isn't what we achieved. It's how we achieved it. She gestured to her team. These 4 people represent the hundreds of sailors, officers, and civilian personnel who did the actual work. I'm going to let them tell you their story. Because the Coronado model isn't about one admiral making brilliant decisions. It's about leadership that listens, systems that support rather than constrain, and people who are empowered to solve problems. For the next 3 hours, Castillo explained the logistics reforms. Ramirez demonstrated the maintenance protocols. Harris walked through the communications upgrade. Ortega discussed the cultural transformation and morale initiatives. And throughout it all, Elena watched the audience. She saw commanders taking notes furiously. She saw executive officers nodding in recognition they'd faced the same problems at their own bases. She saw junior officers energized by the possibility that things could actually change. During the Q&A session, a commander from a base in Japan raised his hand. Admiral Cross, this all sounds impressive. But how did you get the bureaucracy to cooperate? How did you get funding approved so quickly? How did you overcome the resistance that exists in every large organization? Elena smiled. By spending 4 days undercover, working as a logistics clerk, seeing firsthand exactly what my people were dealing with. When I went to Admiral Harrison with my requirements, I didn't have theories. I had data. Specific failures. Documented incompetence. Clear operational impacts. And I had solutions that I'd watched my own people develop because they lived the problems every day. Another hand, a lieutenant commander from San Diego. Ma'am, you mentioned relieving your supply officer within hours of taking command. How did you have the confidence to make such a significant personnel decision that quickly? Because I'd spent 4 days watching him fail. I'd traced requisitions he'd mishandled. I'd seen the impact of his incompetence on operational readiness. When you truly understand the problems, not from reports, but from direct observation, the decisions become clear. And yes, it was risky. But allowing him to continue failing my people would have been riskier. The questions continued. Each answer reinforced the same themes. Understand your people, remove barriers, Empower competence, hold the incompetent accountable, and never accept a system that makes good people fail. When the conference ended, Elena was surrounded by officers wanting to know more, wanting guidance for their own bases, wanting to understand how they could replicate what Coronado had achieved. She gave them all the same advice. Start by listening. Really listening. Not to reports or briefings, but to the people doing the work. Understand what they're actually dealing with, and then fight like hell to give them what they need to succeed. 9 months after taking command, Elena received a call from the Secretary of the Navy. Admiral Cross, I've been reviewing the performance metrics from Coronado. Operational readiness, up 43%. Retention rates up 37%. Morale indices at record highs. Training completion rates exceeding standards by 20%. And all of this achieved under budget. Thank you, sir. It's been a team effort. I'm nominating you for the Distinguished Service Medal. But more importantly, I'm asking you to extend your command tour. Typically, we rotate base commanders every 2 years. I want you at Coronado for 4. And I want you to mentor other commanders in implementing your model. Elena was quiet for a moment. Sir, I'm honored. But I need to make something clear. This isn't my model. It's what happens when leaders actually care about the people they command and fight to remove the barriers preventing them from succeeding. Any competent commander could replicate this if they're willing to challenge the bureaucracy and prioritize people over process. Which is exactly why we need you teaching it. Most commanders aren't willing to challenge the bureaucracy. You are, and you've proven it works. So yes, I'm extending your tour. And yes, you're going to help fix other bases. The Navy needs more leaders like you, Elena. And you're going to help create them. After the call ended, Elena sat in her office, processing. 4 years at Coronado. 4 years to sustain what they'd built, to refine the systems, to develop the next generation of leaders who would carry these principles forward. She looked out her window at the parade field where she'd revealed herself 9 months ago. The field where 3,000 people had saluted not just her rank, but what she represented: leadership that actually cared, that actually fought for them, that actually delivered on its promises. 4 more years to make sure this wasn't just a temporary improvement that would fade when she left. 4 more years to institutionalize excellence so deeply that it would survive leadership changes, budget cuts, and bureaucratic pressure. She could do that. She would do that. For her people. For the Navy. For every sailor who deserved leadership that understood their struggles and fought to make their service meaningful. 1 year after taking command, Elena stood once again on the parade field. Not for a ceremony, but for the weekly all-hands formation, another innovation she'd implemented. Every Monday morning, the entire base gathered for 15 minutes. Announcements, recognition, motivation. Good morning, Coronado. Good morning, ma'am. 3,000 voices, strong and unified. This week, we're celebrating several achievements. The aviation maintenance team completed a record inspection with 0 discrepancies. The logistics office processed its 10,000th requisition without error. The communications team was selected to train personnel from 3 other bases in Pacific Fleet. And our security forces successfully coordinated with local law enforcement on a joint exercise that's being held up as a model for civil-military cooperation. She paused, looking out over the formation. But the achievement I'm most proud of is this. For the 12th consecutive month, not a single person requested transfer away from this base for morale or quality of life reasons. You want to stay here. And that tells me we're doing something right. Applause and cheers rolled across the formation. Excellence isn't easy. It requires constant effort, constant attention, constant improvement. But it's possible. You prove it every single day. And I am honored to serve alongside you. She saluted the formation. They saluted back, 3,000 hands rising in perfect synchronization. A sound like thunder. A gesture that still moved her every single time. As the formation dismissed and personnel returned to their duties, Commander Hendricks approached. You know, Admiral, I've been thinking about that first day you walked through the gate in civilian clothes. If I'd known who you were, I probably would have stopped you, insisted on proper protocol, made sure you were received with appropriate honors. Which is exactly why I didn't tell you. Right. Because you needed to see us as we really were, not as we pretended to be for visiting brass. He smiled. I'm glad you did it that way. Because what you built here, it's not based on fear or performance. It's based on genuine understanding of what we needed. What we still need. This isn't finished, James. Excellence is a journey, not a destination. Understood, ma'am. Though I have to say, if this is the journey, I'm happy to keep walking. 2 years later, Admiral Elena Cross stood in the Pentagon, briefing the Chief of Naval Operations and a room full of flag officers on the Coronado model that had now been successfully implemented at 7 other ON bases across the Pacific and Atlantic fleets. The key, she explained, is authentic leadership. Not leadership that commands from a distance, but leadership that understands from within. At Coronado, I spent 4 days undercover because I needed to see the truth. Not every commander needs to go undercover, but every commander needs to find a way to truly understand what their people are dealing with. Not through reports, but through direct engagement. She advanced her presentation slide, showing the dramatic improvements across all 7 bases that had adopted her approach. When you prioritize people over process, when you remove bureaucratic barriers, when you give competent personnel the tools and authority they need, excellence becomes inevitable, not because you demanded it, but because you made it possible. After the briefing, the CNO pulled her aside. Elena, the Navy is creating a new position, Director of Leadership Development and Organizational Excellence. It's a band, 2-star billet. You'd be responsible for implementing the Coronado model across the entire fleet. You'd mentor base commanders, redesign systems, and fundamentally change how we approach leadership development. Elena took a breath. Leave Coronado? The base she'd fought for, bled for, built from brokenness into brilliance? Sir, I'm honored. But I made a commitment to Coronado for 4 years. I still have time left on that tour. I know. That's why the position doesn't start for 18 months. Finish what you started at Coronado. Make sure the transformation is sustainable. And then come teach the rest of the Navy how to do what you did. Elena nodded slowly. On one condition. Sir, Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Castillo becomes the next commanding officer of Coronado when I leave. She understands what we built. She'll sustain it. Done. Anyone else you want to protect? Commander Hendricks promoted to captain and assigned as her XO. Warrant Officer Ramirez given a commission and assigned to fleet maintenance. Chief Harris promoted to senior chief and assigned to communications training command. I want the people who did the work to get the recognition and opportunities they've earned. The CNO smiled. I expected nothing less from you. Consider it done. 18 months later, Elena's final day at Coronado arrived with the kind of bittersweet emotion that comes from leaving a place you've poured your heart into. The change of command ceremony was scheduled for 1,000 hours. Captain Rachel Castillo, promoted and selected for command, would assume responsibility for the base Elena had transformed. But before the ceremony, Elena took one last walk. The same route she'd walked on her first day, undercover and anonymous. The motor pool where Sergeant Ramirez had worked after hours, on broken trucks now spotless, efficient, a model for the entire fleet. The communications hub where Petty Officer Harris had maintained failing equipment with baling wire and prayers now state-of-the-art. Training personnel from across the Pacific. The logistics office where Major Castillo had fought bureaucracy while drowning in impossible workload now running smoothly. Processing requisitions faster than any other base in the Navy. The parade field, where she'd revealed herself to 3,000 stunned personnel, now a symbol of what leadership could achieve when it truly cared. Everything had changed. And yet the core mission remained the same. Serve the people who serve the nation. At 1,000 hours, Elena stood on the stage in her dress whites, preparing to transfer command. The base was assembled in formation, not 3,000 people anymore, but 3,500. Coronado had grown as its reputation spread. As sailors requested transfers here instead of away, Captain Castillo stood beside her, ready to accept the responsibility Elena was about to pass on. 2.5 years ago, Elena began. I walked through that gate wearing civilian clothes and carrying a duffel bag. I spent 4 days invisible among you because I needed to understand what you were really dealing with. What I found was a base full of good people trapped in broken systems. What we built together is proof that excellence isn't about demanding more from people, it's about removing the barriers that prevent them from being their best. She turned to face Castillo. Rachel, you held this base together when it should have collapsed. You never gave up. You never stopped fighting for your people. You are exactly the kind of leader the Navy needs. And I know you will not only sustain what we built, you'll make it even better. The transfer of command was seamless. Castillo accepted the base colors with steady hands and a fierce determination in her eyes. And when Castillo called the formation to attention for Elena's final departure, 3,500 hands rose in salute. The sound of boots striking the ground rolled across the parade field, like thunder, louder than Elena's arrival ceremony, deeper, more profound. Because this wasn't protocol. This was gratitude. This was respect earned through understanding, through sacrifice, through fighting for people who had been overlooked for too long. Elena returned the salute, her eyes burning, her throat tight with emotion. She had walked among them as nobody. She had seen their struggles. She had understood their challenges. And together, they had proven that leadership wasn't about commanding from above. It was about serving from within. As she walked across the parade field for the last time, the formation remained at attention. Salutes held. A final gesture of respect for the Admiral, who had changed everything by simply caring enough to see the truth. 5 years after Elena left Coronado, the base was featured in a Navy-wide documentary about organizational excellence. Captain Rachel Castillo, now in her 3rd year as commanding officer, walked the camera crew through the facilities. Admiral Cross taught us that excellence isn't complicated, Rachel explained. It's about listening to your people, removing barriers, and empowering competence. Every system we have, every process we've implemented, it all stems from that simple principle. The documentary showed the motor pool, now run by Lieutenant Commander Ramirez, whose maintenance protocols were Navy-wide standards. It showed the communications hub, where Senior Chief Harris trained personnel from across the fleet. It showed the logistics office, where error rates remained at near zero and morale remained at record highs. The remarkable thing, Rachel told the camera, is that this didn't require some genius admiral with a magic solution. It required a leader who cared enough to understand what we were dealing with and fought to give us what we needed. Any commander could do this. They just have to be willing to prioritize people over process. The documentary ended with footage from Elena's arrival ceremony, the moment she'd revealed herself to 3,000 stunned personnel, and the narrator asked the question that had become central to Navy leadership development. What would you see if you walked among your people? Invisible and anonymous. Would you see excellence being supported? Or would you see good people trapped in broken systems? Admiral Elena Cross had answered that question for Coronado. And in doing so, she'd changed how the Navy thought about leadership forever. Not by commanding from above, but by understanding from within. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where are you watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget.